he signed a $15 billion sweetheart subsidy deal with Stellantis. And now, that same company, taking our tax dollars, the equivalent of $1,000 for every family in Canada, is shipping the jobs to the United States of America.
By the time they ask questions on this side of the House, every single member on this side, Mr. Speaker, we're fighting for Canada. We're fighting for auto industry. We're fighting for our workers. We're fighting to build Canada strong, Mr. Speaker. We should all join to defend our workers in the middle of a trade war. We don't need that kind of conservative politics. We need to stand up for Canada. Build Canada strong. I believe in Canada, Mr. Speaker.
Canada wasn't blindsided. Despite the shouting matches in question period, despite Pierre Poilievre's theatrics, and despite Donald Trump's attempts to take a victory lap, the truth is quieter and far more inconvenient for Washington. Ottawa anticipated the risk long before Stellantis announced anything. They understood that Trump's second-term industrial pressure would test every multinational automaker operating in North America. And that is why the public version of the Stellantis contract contains redactions, not because the government is hiding incompetence, but because withholding certain details can preserve strategic flexibility, something any government needs in the middle of a continent-wide trade storm. So while headlines frame this as Stellantis shifting jobs to Illinois, the deeper story is that Canada had already built mechanisms to protect its interests if such a shift occurred. In October 2025, Stellantis confirmed its plan to move Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois. Trump immediately celebrated, calling the decision proof that his tariff and subsidy pressure was working. In Ottawa, Poilievre denounced the government for providing billions in support while allegedly failing to secure jobs. He repeatedly demanded the full, unredacted contract. But the public version of the deal, like many large industrial contracts, contains sections withheld for confidentiality, a standard practice in both government procurement and commercial partnerships. And according to reporting from Reuters and Global News, the complete version is accessible only to members of a designated parliamentary committee, not to the broader public. Crucially, this entire political storm unfolded just as the federal government invoked formal dispute settlement proceedings against Stellantis. That move, independently confirmed by Reuters, shows that Canada believes it has enforceable obligations to defend and is prepared to use them. This is not the behavior of a government caught off guard. It is the behavior of a government acting on provisions it expected it might one day need. Opposition critics have framed the redactions as a cover-up, but several analysts and industry observers have suggested a more straightforward explanation. Redactions in industrial contracts are common because they contain commercially sensitive material, negotiation positions, or compliance frameworks that cannot be released without compromising future bargaining strength. While the precise contents of the redacted sections remain undisclosed, it is reasonable and consistent with standard practice to assume they may relate to performance obligations, investment conditions, or consequences tied to failing to meet agreed-upon targets. Nothing in public reporting contradicts the idea that such clauses could exist, especially because Canada initiated dispute proceedings only after Stellantis announced its shift. The key point is this: the redactions are not proof of wrongdoing. They are a sign that the contract contains binding material Canada does not want misinterpreted, weaponized, or exposed in the middle of an ongoing trade standoff. To understand why Stellantis made the move, we must understand Trump's broader strategy. His second-term trade doctrine is built around aggressive tariffs, including the revived 25% auto tariff, and a system of targeted subsidies designed to lure manufacturing into the U.S. Stellantis did not act out of ideology. It acted under pressure. Trump needed a symbolic reshoring win. Stellantis wanted to secure American incentives. The two priorities aligned. But neither Trump nor Stellantis controls the legal agreement governing the company's Canadian operations. Canada does. And that contract, whatever its full contents, is now the basis for Ottawa's formal challenge. Narratives can shift quickly, and Canada is now asserting its interpretation of the deal. Since taking office in March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney has steered Canada toward a more self-reliant industrial strategy. His approach blends economic diversification with contractual enforcement. Canada has invested heavily in EV supply chains, battery manufacturing, and critical minerals, but Carney has repeatedly emphasized that public money must deliver public benefit. This philosophy explains Canada's rapid response to Stellantis. A government that expected no obligations would not launch dispute proceedings. A government that believed it had no leverage would not escalate the issue. Carney's background, leading both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, shapes his instincts. He understands leverage, risk, and negotiation dynamics. His government stance signals that Canada anticipated turbulence from Washington and built contracts robust enough to survive it. Canada is not reacting emotionally. Canada is executing structurally. During question period, Poilievre repeated that investment is fleeing Canada and jobs are going to the U.S. But that framing omits the central fact. The Stellantis shift occurred amid deliberate U.S. distortion of the market through tariffs and subsidies. Canada did not cause this. Trump did. And Canada is not accepting it passively. Ministers emphasize that Canada is in the middle of a trade war, a line that reflects both the reality of U.S. policy and the government's intention to defend its position. The redactions may frustrate critics, but they also reinforce something essential. Canada retains tools that are not visible to the public, and that is precisely why they can be effective. Canada's first step has already been taken, filing a formal dispute. That alone signals confidence in the strength of the contract. Next comes the financial component. If the dispute panel finds Stellantis in violation of its commitments, Ottawa has the right to freeze payments, seek reimbursement, or terminate portions of the deal. Beyond the legal dimension, Canada is doubling down on its domestic automotive strategy. Investments in battery plants, R&D clusters, and partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the EU continue to expand Canada's industrial footing. These alliances create alternatives to Trump-era volatility, and they raise the cost for companies that assume the U.S. is the only option. Diplomatically, Ottawa is aligning itself with other nations facing similar tariff pressure. In doing so, it transforms a bilateral problem into a multilateral one and reduces America's leverage in the long term. At first glance, Stellantis' move looks like a symbolic defeat for Canada, but the moment you look beyond the surface, the picture changes. Canada anticipated the risk. Canada wrote agreements that allow it to respond, and Canada acted swiftly once the company revealed its intentions. Trump may enjoy the optics of a short-term win, but Ottawa still controls the contract, the dispute mechanism, and the industrial policy that shapes Canada's economic future. The real question now becomes, if Canada prepared this carefully for Stellantis, what other safeguards is Ottawa ready to deploy as the trade war intensifies?
Canada and the United States had a relationship built up over decades that the U.S. decided unilaterally to change. They didn't consult us. This wasn't a discussion, negotiation. They unilaterally changed it. We're not even going to sign a good deal. We're going to sign a great deal for Canada. And yes, we can give ourselves more than the Americans can take away.
Prime Minister Mark Carney just did what many Canadians have quietly wanted from their leader for years. He looked straight into the camera on one of the biggest media platforms in the country and said out loud what most politicians only whisper behind closed doors. During a tense and unusually candid interview with Toronto Life, Carney exposed the way Donald Trump pressures Canada, how the relationship has shifted permanently, and why this country must now stand on its own feet like never before. It was calm, it was controlled, and yet it felt like the verbal equivalent of a thunderclap. This was Carney at his sharpest, not angry, not emotional, but absolutely immovable. And in doing so, he delivered a message that resonated with millions across the country. Canada is not a junior partner. Canada is not a bargaining chip, and Canada is definitely not anyone's 51st state. The interview landed at a tense moment in Canada-U.S. relations, with Trump's second-term White House expanding tariffs and reshaping cross-border trade. New duties, including the 25% tariff on medium and heavy-duty trucks that took effect on November 1st, have already hit Ontario's auto sector and pushed the Bank of Canada to downgrade growth forecasts. Against this backdrop, Carney sat down with Toronto Life and spoke with unusual candor. He revealed that he and Trump text directly, describing late-night messages written in all caps and the president's habit of applying pressure at every opportunity. Carney emphasized that Trump negotiates by pushing hard on leverage points, something Canada must understand but no longer accept as normal. Then came the line that has already gone viral across Canadian social media. When Carney was asked about Trump's repeated jokes that Canada should one day become America's 51st state, the Prime Minister did not flinch. His answer was simple, firm, and delivered with the kind of national confidence that stays with you long after you hear it. Never, never, ever.
We are not the state there. He wishes that we would be part of the United States. And as I said in the Oval Office when he said, never say never, I said, never, never, ever.
Carney's interview marks a turning point, not just between him and Trump, but in how Canada sees itself in relation to its massive neighbor. For nearly 4 decades, from the 1980s free trade era to the early 2020s, Canada and the United States grew closer and closer, building supply chains, integrating industries, and relying on the assumption that the border was no longer a political fault line, but an economic bridge. Carney made it unmistakably clear that those days are over. The United States, he said, unilaterally changed the relationship. They did not consult Canada, they did not negotiate the shift, they simply imposed it. And that means Canada has to adapt. According to Carney, 85% of Canadian trade remains tariff-free, the lowest average tariff exposure of any country trading with the U.S., but the era of automatic goodwill is gone. Canada must now negotiate from a position of strategic self-interest, not nostalgia for a friendlier past. This is not anti-American sentiment. This is Canada waking up to reality. Carney is effectively telling Canadians that reliance is no longer a strategy. Resilience is. And the sooner Canada builds its own economic engine, housing, energy, AI, ports, manufacturing, the sooner it can negotiate with the U.S. as an equal rather than a dependent.
One of the most striking parts of the interview was how Carney described Trump's style without ever resorting to insult. He acknowledged Trump's skill, his experience, and his understanding of power. But through understated and diplomatic language, Carney revealed exactly how Trump operates: identify a pressure point, hit it hard, and keep pushing until the other side feels the squeeze. Carney's response is a contrast in leadership styles. Trump pressures, Carney prepares. Trump improvises, Carney strategizes. Trump sends all-caps texts in the middle of the night. Carney builds 25-year plans for national housing, clean energy, and industrial independence. The interview exposed not only Trump's behavior, but also Canada's new posture, steady, disciplined, and unwilling to be knocked off balance. And that is why the never, never, ever line landed so powerfully. Carney didn't just reject the idea of Canada being absorbed by the U.S. He rejected the mindset of inferiority that Trump's rhetoric relies on. It was a sovereignty moment, one that reminded Canadians of the quiet strength embedded in the national character. Beneath the political tension, Carney tapped into something deeper, a sense of national pride that often goes unstated. He pointed out that Canada is one of the most admired countries on earth, a place people choose, not a place that needs validation from any foreign president. By highlighting Canada's diversity, stability, and social generosity, Carney reframed the conversation away from Trump's bravado and toward Canada's values that cannot be traded, bought, or bullied. This is why the interview resonated so intensely. It wasn't about attacking the U.S., it was about defending Canada, and doing so with the confidence of a country that knows exactly who it is. Carney also used the interview to outline his long-term vision. He described a country preparing for the largest nation-building era in a generation. 65,000 new homes in Downsview, new transit links, massive clean energy projects, a national industrial strategy built around AI, and partnerships across Asia and Europe to reduce economic dependence on America. This is not rhetorical flourish. This is a plan shaped by necessity. As U.S. tariffs become more unpredictable and global rivalries intensify, Canada needs to diversify, innovate, and build, not react. Carney's comments make it clear that Canada's future strength will come from its ability to chart its own path rather than follow the gravitational pull of American politics. Carney's interview was not a spectacle. It was not a rant. It was the opposite, a calm articulation of sovereignty at a moment when Canada needed clarity more than comfort. By exposing the pressures from Washington, naming the reality of a changed relationship, and reminding Canadians of their own national identity, Carney delivered one of the most important political messages of his premiership. The question now is whether Canada can move fast enough to match the scale of this new era, to build the housing, energy systems, technology sectors, and trade partnerships that will secure its future. Trump will continue to apply pressure. The U.S. will continue to act in its own interest. But Canada, for the first time in a long time, seems ready to respond on its own terms. And after watching Carney on that stage, one thing is clear. This is not a country that bends. This is a country that builds.
With reports saying that Mark Carney will talk with Xi Jinping on Friday.
I think for Prime Minister Carney, it's important because he wants to recalibrate the relationship with China, and he wants to open up high-level dialogue. He essentially wants to say that Canada wants to have a relationship that allows us to advance some of our interests, particularly around trade and commercial relations.
On the eve of the APEC summit in Jeonju, South Korea, the world's eyes are once again fixed on Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Their meeting tomorrow is expected to dominate headlines, as both sides search for a fragile ceasefire in a trade war that has shaken global markets. But away from that spotlight, another leader has already made quiet progress. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney arrived in Asia earlier this month, and by the time he reached APEC, he had already secured one major win: a breakthrough at the ASEAN summit in Malaysia that opened new economic doors for Canada. Now, as he prepares to meet Xi Jinping tomorrow, Carney stands on firmer ground. His government has begun rebuilding Canada's presence in Asia while maintaining its independence between the U.S. and China.
Carney's appearance at the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, October 26 to 28, 2025, marked Canada's most active engagement with Southeast Asia in years. According to Global Affairs Canada, the Prime Minister met with several regional counterparts, including the leaders of Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. The discussions focused on energy cooperation, digital trade, and supply chain resilience, key themes of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Malaysia's Trade Ministry confirmed that both sides agreed to expand cooperation in liquefied natural gas, LNG, and clean energy technology, part of a wider effort to help ASEAN transition away from coal. Ottawa also opened exploratory talks with the Philippines on a potential bilateral trade framework, following Manila's recent push to attract Western investment. ASEAN represents a market of more than 600 million people, with a combined GDP above $3.6 trillion and an average growth rate of around 5%, World Bank 2025. For Carney, the region offers not just export opportunities, but strategic breathing room, a chance to diversify away from dependence on the United States without falling into Beijing's sphere. Observers noted that Carney's message was clear. The country is ready to be a constructive economic partner in Asia, bringing energy, technology, and finance without forcing nations to pick sides. For many Southeast Asian leaders, that approach was a welcome contrast to the zero-sum politics of Washington and Beijing. By the time Carney left Kuala Lumpur for South Korea, Canada had positioned itself as a reliable new player in the region's economic future, and that momentum would soon carry into APEC. Carney's next challenge comes tomorrow at APEC, where he is scheduled to meet Xi Jinping on October 31, their first formal conversation since Canada and China fell into a tariff battle in late 2024. That dispute began when Ottawa imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, mirroring the Trump administration's policy to shield its auto industry. Beijing retaliated swiftly with its own 100% duties on Canadian canola oil and further taxes on peas and pork. Agriculture Canada's August 2025 report estimated a combined impact of $2.35 billion USD in canola losses, $637 million USD in peas, and $468 million USD in pork. Numbers that echoed the 2019-2020 crisis that paralyzed prairie farm exports. Beijing enters this meeting confident, believing it holds the upper hand as U.S. tariffs continue to strain Western markets. But Carney arrives better prepared than any Canadian leader in recent years. His success at ASEAN gives him a fresh narrative. Canada is not isolated nor desperate. It has options. Canadian officials say Ottawa will press Beijing to lift agricultural tariffs and reopen access for canola exports. In exchange, Canada may consider reviewing EV import restrictions once fair competition and environmental standards are in place. The meeting also carries a powerful political subtext. For years, Canadian leaders have struggled to balance economic pragmatism with growing concerns over human rights and national security in dealings with China. Carney's team is walking that fine line again, re-engaging Beijing economically without backing away from Canada's values. Officials say the talks will focus strictly on trade and agriculture, leaving sensitive security issues for later channels. This approach reflects Carney's broader philosophy of principled pragmatism: engage when it serves the national interest, but set clear boundaries when it touches sovereignty. Domestically, his stance has drawn mixed reactions. Prairie farm groups welcome any progress with China, while opposition lawmakers warn against becoming too dependent on a partner known for economic coercion. Economists note that Canada's exports to China still total about 29.9 billion Canadian dollars a year, Statistics Canada 2024. So even a partial reopening could deliver tangible benefits to rural communities. In that sense, the stakes are both political and personal, a test of whether Carney can turn diplomatic restraint into economic relief. No immediate breakthrough is expected, but officials close to the talks say both sides see value in starting a structured dialogue after years of mistrust. If that happens, tomorrow's meeting could mark the first step toward normalization.
Carney's approach embodies a broader philosophy: autonomy through engagement. Rather than choosing between the United States and China, Ottawa is building a web of relationships that anchors Canada in multiple regions at once. In East Asia, Canada has deepened critical minerals ties with Japan and South Korea. In Europe, the August 2025 EU agreement opened clean energy investment worth about $600 billion USD, European Commission data. And in Southeast Asia, the Kuala Lumpur agreements have positioned Canada as a new partner for energy and infrastructure projects across the region. Each step reduces Canada's exposure to tariff wars and political pressure. It also shows a different kind of leadership: quiet, pragmatic, and anchored in long-term stability instead of short-term headlines. At a time when the United States demands alignment and China seeks influence, Carney's Canada is demonstrating that middle powers can exercise real agency by choosing partnership over submission. As the sun sets over Gyeongju tonight, the spotlight still belongs to Trump and Xi. Their meeting tomorrow will fill the front pages and rattle the markets. But Mark Carney's story is unfolding in a different tone, one of steady diplomacy and strategic patience. He arrives at APEC with new momentum from ASEAN and a measured plan for Beijing. Whatever comes of tomorrow's talks, Canada has already regained its voice in Asia. In an era defined by noise and division, Carney's quiet strategy reminds the world that power isn't always about volume. It's about consistency, credibility, and the ability to build bridges when others burn them. While others fight for dominance, Canada quietly fights for relevance and may have just secured both.
And Canada called me a couple of weeks ago. They want to be part of it. To which I said, well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state.
More than 70% of respondents feel that Trump's comments have strengthened Canadian pride. Close to 80% of Canadians would never vote to become part of the U.S.
When Donald Trump joked that Canada could become the 51st state, it might have sounded like a throwaway line from a campaign rally. But for Canadians, it hit differently. A new Ipsos survey for Global News found that nearly 80% of Canadians said they would never vote to join the United States, while more than 70% said the remark made them prouder to be Canadian. That statistic alone tells the story of a shift in attitude. What began as a jab from Washington has turned into a rallying cry north of the border. Trump's tariffs, his insults, and his brand of political showmanship have not weakened Canada. They have done the opposite. Across provinces, people are turning inward, thinking about what it means to rely less on the U.S. market. From lumber towns in British Columbia to battery factories in Ontario, the same idea is spreading. Canada can build, Canada can supply, and Canada can stand on its own. This new wave of determination didn't appear in a vacuum. It began with economic pressure, diplomatic tension, and a feeling that Washington had crossed a line not just in trade, but in respect.
When Trump returned to power in January 2025, his administration launched a new wave of import duties on major trading partners. Canada was hit especially hard. By March 2025, Washington imposed 25 to 35% duties on key exports: softwood lumber, steel, automotive parts, and furniture. Even energy, long protected, faced a 10% tax. These measures, justified on security grounds, aimed to pressure Ottawa in the USMCA review. Instead, they damaged both economies. In British Columbia, cross-border traffic dropped for 8 straight months. Data from the Cascade Border Data Warehouse showed that between February and September, the number of BC vehicles heading south fell by 40% year over year. That decline reflected more than economics. Many Canadians said they no longer felt welcome in the U.S. Workers in the lumber sector stopped traveling south. Families canceled vacations. Meanwhile, small towns in Washington state, long dependent on Canadian shoppers, began to suffer. The Border Policy Research Institute warned the trend was alarming and could force local businesses to change how they operate. Trump's tariffs didn't just hurt Canada, they began eroding America's own border economy.
Right now, we're going to boycott it.
I am not interested in traveling to the States.
Doesn't sound like a very nice place to visit right now.
The trade pressure might have been manageable on its own, but Trump's comments added a different kind of sting. During a public event in mid-2025, he claimed that Canada had called him wanting to be part of it. He followed with the line, "Why don't you just join our country, become the 51st state?" For many Canadians, that was the moment the debate stopped being about tariffs and started being about dignity. The Ipsos poll for Global News, conducted shortly afterward, revealed a national shift in mood. Nearly 4 out of 5 Canadians rejected even the idea of joining the U.S., and most said the statement had strengthened their pride in being Canadian. Political analysts say the comment touched a nerve because it came at a time when Canada's sovereignty was already under pressure. Trump had linked his 51st state quip to discussions about a joint missile defense system, something he called the Golden Dome. The suggestion that defense cooperation could come with a hint of annexation was viewed in Ottawa as deeply offensive. By the time Prime Minister Mark Carney prepared for his meeting with Trump in early October, the mood in Canada was unmistakable. The 51st state line had become a symbol, proof that the United States was no longer treating its northern neighbor as an equal partner. Instead of bending to that pressure, the backlash united the country. Across political lines, Canadians began to rally around one idea. If Washington wanted dominance, Canada would answer with independence. Ottawa's first step was economic retaliation. In March 2025, Canada imposed counter tariffs worth about 30 billion Canadian dollars, matching Washington's duties dollar for dollar. The targets were deliberate: American steel, aluminum, household goods, and even symbolic products like lawn equipment and household tools. This move wasn't meant to escalate forever. It was designed to show that Canada would not remain passive. By early September, Prime Minister Carney announced that Canada would lift some of those counter tariffs, but only for products compliant with the USMCA's regional content rules. It was a tactical signal. Canada would reward fair trade, not political coercion. The decision had immediate local effects. Cross-border trade in certain consumer goods improved slightly, and businesses in border towns like Blaine, Washington, began to see Canadian customers returning. But the political message was unmistakable. Canada was taking the high ground, showing restraint while maintaining leverage. Carney's words summed up the new posture clearly: Canada is not for sale. That phrase became a headline across national outlets and a quiet statement of policy. Canada would negotiate, but never surrender its sovereignty. Behind the scenes, Canada also began accelerating programs that could reduce dependence on U.S. supply chains. Provinces rolled out incentives for critical minerals, electric vehicle components, and defense manufacturing. Ontario announced a $17.5 million grant to Electra battery materials for North America's first cobalt sulfate refinery, designed to produce 6,500 tons a year, enough to power 1 million electric vehicles. At the same time, the federal government opened consultations to speed up mining approvals under the One Canadian Economy Bill, ensuring future projects wouldn't be stalled by the same bureaucratic delays that had haunted resource development for decades. The message was clear. If Washington wanted to weaponize trade, Canada would respond by weaponizing innovation and production.
As autumn arrived, a new narrative emerged. Trump's tariffs and remarks had backfired. They had driven Canadians to look inward, invest locally, and redefine sovereignty. Communities once reliant on U.S. buyers found new export partners in Europe and Asia. Ottawa expanded trade missions to Indonesia, South Korea, and the EU, focusing on diversification. Pollsters noted that national pride and support for independent economic policy had reached their highest levels in more than a decade. Even Canada's diplomatic tone shifted, less reactive, more strategic. Trump's pressure campaign, meant to extract concessions, instead strengthened Canada's resolve. His 51st state line, meant to assert dominance, only underscored the country's independence. Border crossings may have fallen, but investment at home is climbing. Public unity has grown stronger, and industries once tied to U.S. demand are finding their own footing. From Ottawa to Vancouver, one message echoes: Canada will not be intimidated. It will innovate. In the end, Trump's campaign of pressure did not weaken his northern neighbor. It gave Canada a reason to rebuild, not as a sovereign, but as a sovereign nation determined to shape its own future. That is the paradox of 2025. Every attempt to make Canada smaller has, in fact, made it stronger.